Hi there, welcome to another Friday feature for what is the 27th of October 2023. And in this week's episode, I just want to follow on from a previous Friday feature that we did at the end of September, where we looked at the forensic science regulators' codes of practice and the impact that that can have on the activity of vehicle system forensics. Certainly for those practitioners here in the UK, ourselves included, the codes of practice that have been introduced do have implications if we are going to continue investigating a modern vehicle for data that can assist in crime investigations, and evidence is going to be presented within that particular arena. So I want to take the feature that I did last time and just move it on a little bit further to give you a bit of context as to how you might look at doing some of these processes with regards to the activities that may be involved in examining a modern vehicle for data. I should say at the outset that this is an area that I am passionate about, but it's only my opinion. I've got 7 years experience of dealing with this type of work solely, vehicle system forensics, but that backs on to 17 years of dealing with serious criminal investigations in cases where people have died. So predominantly road collisions, but murders too. And I continue to work on those type of cases here in the UK, predominantly dealing with vehicle system forensics. So I have got a bit of background with regards to dealing with complex cases and having evidence tested in both a criminal court, but also a coronial court as well. And some of these cases can be very, very emotive. So evidence does get scrutinized very, very closely in both those arenas. So I'm passionate about getting things right because I've been a family liaison officer in the past as well. And if you get some of your investigation wrong and you mislead a family as to what you think might be the case, then that can have devastating consequences, not just for an investigation team and the family at the back of it, but also the judiciary as well. And this is why the codes of practice are being brought in to try and improve the standards and the limitations of what emphasis we might be putting on forensic evidence that is playing a part in some of these serious investigations. So I think it's important for us to not just say the codes have come in and forgotten about them to a degree. We need to keep working with it. And as you'll see, vehicles are a little bit like eating an elephant. You can't do it all at once, and you're going to have to break things down if you're dealing with them properly and you want to give a good quality service with regards to putting forensic evidence in the courtroom. So for those people that are watching this in the Vehicle Network application, there will be a resource underneath the video, which is an excerpt from the presentation that I'm about to put onto screen. If you are watching this on YouTube, because I will put it out onto YouTube straight away so that those people that potentially want access to it can get it straight away, you can just drop me an email to training@hapshaw.co.uk and we will ensure that we will get you that information emailed out to you as well if you so desire it. So let me just put this presentation up onto screen a second. Forgive the rough and readiness of the presentation itself. I've just sort of made notes on a PowerPoint so that I can get some of these points across. But in this follow-on, I want to talk a little bit about why it's my belief that we should have vehicle system forensics or acquiring data from a modern vehicle as a forensic science activity within the codes of practice. And then for sub-activities around the different types of data acquisitions and tasks that we might have to do at the vehicle listed underneath that main heading. Because at the moment, we seem to be kind of shoehorning vehicles in to the codes of practice under all those identified areas that I spoke about in the video last month. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the dangers of having generic SOPs for vehicle system forensics examinations and how you might end up with a consistency management system rather than a quality management system. And then I'm going to look at how you can get around that with regards to something that I touched upon again in the first video, adaptive task sequencing, in order to make it a quality management system rather than a consistency management system. And that all links back really to a strategy that you should have before you're commencing the activity of vehicle system forensics. And I can't emphasize that enough, really. The planning of one of these examinations is where a lot of the work is done with regards to then just executing it when you do attend a vehicle and make those efforts to recover data from it that is potentially going to be used in a criminal case. So, like I've said, it's only my opinion, but having looked at the codes of practice and having spent 7 years purely working in vehicle system forensics as part of running our own company, then I do believe it should have its own area and be classed as its own forensic science activity, with those sub-activities underneath. And to back that belief up, I put some points up on the slide now that really try to emphasize and back up that opinion, really, from some of the examples I'm going to give. I make no apologies for repeating the fact that the vehicle is a safety critical system. I talked about this in the first video, but I repeat it, it is distinctly different to a consumer device such as a phone or a computer. The vehicle is designed to keep you safe. It's designed to keep other people safe. It kills people every year on our roads. There's around, on average, 1,700 to 1,800 deaths on the UK roads every year. A high percentage of those is going to involve a vehicle. I've not managed to find any statistics as to how often a mobile phone or a computer kills somebody, but the design principles of computers and phones versus cars are markedly different. So I hope that message is starting to get across a little bit now, in the sense that we have to acknowledge the car as a different entity to perhaps some of the other digital devices that we're trying to shoehorn it into that area. The network communication on a vehicle is unique, and it is different to computing in some areas. So if I take the CAN bus network on a vehicle as an example, the way that that communication process takes place is different to how network communication would take place with a computer. We've just actually released a podcast from the vehicle network application that I did in January this year with Dr. Ken Tyndall. And he is somebody that's been involved in the development of the CAN bus network on a vehicle since the early to mid 90s. And he was an influential role in developing some of those solutions that we now have on our vehicles, and is also looking at modern ways as to how to secure that network as well, because of some of the vulnerabilities that we start to see in these types of investigations, whether it's a car that's been stolen and the CAN bus has been compromised, or whether or not it's somebody remotely taking control of a vehicle and potentially causing serious risk or harm to road users as well. So he's a very knowledgeable guy, and he gives some explanations as to how there is a difference between how a car communicates on, say, the CAN bus network versus how a computer communicates as well. So we have to acknowledge that the car is a different piece of technology. Okay. When we look at the codes of practice and those forensic science activities, vehicles and vehicle systems is mentioned once, and it's a tag on line to any other digital device such as drones, vehicle systems. And it's not really given the acknowledgement that it probably does require if you are to start to understand that it is a different entity. And if we're trying to treat it as another method of forensics or another activity of forensics, then we're probably a little bit negligent with regards to being serious about taking vehicle system forensics seriously, because they are different. So this is why I believe there should be an area specifically for dealing with vehicles, because they present all sorts of different issues. Yes, there is some overlap to other areas. There's no two ways about it. If you get a component off a vehicle, such as an infotainment system with a printed circuit board, that potentially looks no different to a printed circuit board from any other electronic item out of a computer as a motherboard, for example, or out of a mobile phone. However, the differences are that infotainment system has just come from being connected to potentially 100 other small computers that are responsible for keeping people safe and that kill people if they're not handled properly. So there is a little bit of overlap, but there are also some subtle differences down the line as well when you start to trace back where these components have come from. If they're being brought out of cars and then being classed as digital devices, we have to acknowledge that there's a bit of a backstory to this component. It's not just the component in itself like a mobile phone. Other digital forensics techniques that we've used in the past can work on vehicles, but there are also some things that aren't applicable, and there are some new techniques, and we need new knowledge and new skills if we're going to look at maximizing the data that we get off a vehicle, and not look at the vehicle in isolation of just saying, well, I'm looking at infotainment and that's all I'm looking at, because you might have to start off on that route before you widen your horizons. But again, if all we're looking at is one area of the vehicle, why would you just look at one ECU and ignore 90? Are you giving it the service that it deserves when you're trying to acquire data from a modern vehicle? Like I say, it all links back to a strategy in some regards, because some of the data on a car might not be applicable. But we need to be mindful that there's a lot of different people with different needs in their investigation coming into the vehicle. And some of them might not know about other areas because they're in a different role. They may be just looking at, say, cell site, and they're not wholly familiar as to what crash data is or what some of the infotainment data is. They're just dealing with purely telecoms data. If they're not looking at the car holistically, they could be missing out on investigative opportunities in there as well. So for me, like I said, it's only my opinion, it should have its own area, especially when I look at some of the forensic science activities that have been identified. It does warrant the need to have its own identity. Okay, why will a generic SOP not be helpful if we're going to look at vehicle system forensics? This has come out of some conversations that I've had over the last month with people that have reached out to me following watching the first video. I've had conversations with various different people, and some of them will say, well, we've been told that we're just going to have a generic SOP for vehicles as to how we deal with them. What I would say is, if you're going to do that, just be mindful that you are limiting the amount of data that you're potentially going to get from a vehicle. You are going to risk overwriting data on a vehicle that could be useful depending on the nature of the case. And if it is one of these cases that involves a death, and you've applied just a generic SOP for your department or your company for dealing with vehicles, and things don't go right in that investigation for a number of reasons, it then comes under review, which this can often be the case when somebody's died, because people do have that passion to keep questioning what's gone on in an investigation, because they've lost a loved one and they felt as though things have not been done properly or dealt with unjustly, and it does come under review. Then are you potentially going to come in for some criticism for not being flexible in your approach, or for potentially overwriting data on a vehicle that was there that could have assisted the case because you not taken the time or the effort to learn a little bit more about how we should potentially be handling a modern motor vehicle when we're dealing with it in a forensic entity. It's a little bit like, I'm sure this exists in many different specialist areas, and this is certainly not going to be unique to vehicles, but in its simplest form, it's a little bit like being not very descriptive over how you're going to do something and just giving it a generic standard operating procedure. So if I give the analogy of a restaurant or a sandwich shop, you might be just saying, make a sandwich by halving the bread and inserting the filling, rather than describing what color bread you're going to use, what filling you're going to use, what order you're going to put the filling into the sandwich to make it taste good. Because if you've just got that generic split the bread, insert the filling, people potentially aren't going to get what they want at the end of the production of that sandwich, because you've not been prescriptive enough. Yes, you've got a process in place. Yes, you've ticked a box, but this is where it comes into having a consistency management system versus a quality management system. So it depends how much work you want to put into this, but like anything in life, the more effort you put in, the better it will be at the other end. The less effort you put in, it's not going to be as good at the other end. As long as you're aware of that and you're able to risk manage that, then that's fine. And you can account for it and you can deal with those issues as and when they arise further down the line, of the customer coming back saying, this is not the filling I wanted, I don't like tuna, as an example in its analogy form. Then as long as you're aware of that and you're prepared to deal with the potential consequences of that when we're dealing with forensic evidence in the criminal justice system, then that's fine. But if you're using a generic SOP for the whole process of examining a vehicle, and this is on the back of experience, you'll have a good consistency management system, but it might not be fit for purpose. I don't work in quality. I've no background in dealing with assessments for quality management systems, or here in the UK, say UCAS, who would come and do assessments. Sometimes it can feel like, well, if somebody's coming to assess me, they must know everything around the nuances of my specialist field, because how can they assess me if they don't know about that? I would argue you maybe need a little bit of both. You need somebody that understands quality management systems. And yes, you might need somebody to give and work together with that person to know that what's being told to them is right. Because if you don't have somebody that has the intricate knowledge of the area that's under assessment, then how do you know that that process is right in the first place? And I guess the difficulty a little bit with vehicles here is that here in the UK, we've no best guidance. We've no documentation that's come out from national bodies to say, this is how we deal with vehicles. These are the suggested best practices, and this is why it's suggested best practice. I'm personally in the middle of writing suggested best practice for this arena, and it's very close to being complete, but it's not complete yet. The only thing that I found in my research around this kind of best practice would be the Scientific Working Group for Digital Evidence, who were an American-based organization that issue a hell of a lot of good practice guides for different types of forensic activities. There is one, and there has been one for infotainment and telematics systems for a considerable amount of time. It's on its third version, and it is literally in the last few days being put out again for comment with regards to an iteration that's been made to that. But it only deals really with infotainment and telematics systems. It's generic for that area of the vehicle. If you're going to look holistically, for me, there are certain elements to that guidance that could be expanded upon for different types of scenarios that we can often find in a vehicle system forensics examination. So it's not easy because we've got nothing to really lead us along to and meet a standard in, well, how do I know what I should be doing to make it a good quality management system versus just having something in place that at least I've got something, but potentially is only a consistency management system. And I don't know who I'm speaking to here. You could be well experienced at doing vehicle system forensics and have decent amount of knowledge, or you could be new to role, and this could have been put on you as a new person to a department or a new person to an organization that has now got the task of putting a quality management system in place or trying to put standard operating procedures in place for this type of activity because it's being pulled under your umbrella of digital forensics, forensic collision investigation, whichever area you may fall into within the world that you're working in. And it's hard. It really is. It really is hard. We've got that problem as an independent company as well. And all we can do and all we've been able to do over the last 7 years is say, this is how we're doing it based on our own experiential learning cycle that we go through each time that we're examining a vehicle and picking up nuances, and for the number of times we've been exposed to those environments, to learn and to take that learning and then refine our processes accordingly. And that is all about having a good quality management system should be constantly refined. It's a living, breathing thing rather than a static option. So try not to get into the habit of just saying, I'm going to have a generic standard operating procedure for how we deal with vehicles if you're going to be serious about it. If you're not going to be serious about it and just you need to have something and your solutions for getting data off cars is minimal, you might be somebody that's just dealing with taking data off an airbag control module with a Bosch CDR tool. You might not be dealing with any other element on that car. Then it's potentially going to be relatively straightforward. But I'm speaking to quite a wide audience of practitioners in putting this video out, and this is because the vehicle hits so many spots, as I identified in that first video, around the different forensic science activities that it falls under, that I'm trying to cater for everybody. And as a company that tries to do everything with regards to vehicles, then I'm trying to give back, what we've picked up over the last 7 years in how you might deal with some of these things, depending on what area of the vehicle and what part you play in getting data from it. So this is a PDF that, like I've said, I will put beneath this video within the vehicle network application. But just as a reminder, if you wanted a copy of this PDF and you're watching this on YouTube, then just send me an email to that address, training@appshaw.co.uk, and I will send it out. Again, it's only my opinion, it's something that I've come up with. But if I just talk you through this, the only place where I would have a generic SOP is at the outset, which you can see with the car at the top of the screen with the box highlighted in green. There are potentially, for me, 2 types of preliminary examinations that we could do with a vehicle, and those 80%, 90% of the time don't really change. Yes, we have to step outside of them sometimes because cars have been damaged, cars have been crashed, keys are not available, but 80 to 90 times out of 100, we're going to be met with the sort of same scenario, and we can have some form of a generic standard operating procedure for dealing with the first part of the vehicle examination before we've started to interact with the vehicle. We've another complexity with vehicles to a degree, in the sense that there could be some physical processing going on here via other departments. So depends again on what department you're in. It depends on what crime type and what incident your vehicle's been involved in. But if it's a crash, you could have a forensic vehicle examiner having a need to examine that vehicle and do some mechanical checks with it as part of a forensic collision investigation case. So you're going to have to take account of where they're going to fit into this process. If it's a vehicle that's being used in crime, you're going to potentially have scenes of crime officers wanting to examine that vehicle. Again, what they do could be impacting on you as a vehicle system forensics investigator. They could be inadvertently overwriting data or generating new data on the vehicle that you don't want them to. You could have bullet trajectory. You could have people wanting to 3D scan inside a vehicle for where a bullet's ended up if somebody's been shot inside a car. So you're going to have to take account of any other physical processing that might be done to that vehicle, both externally and then internally. But once we get inside the vehicle or start to interact with it, this is where I've got this box beneath that in red, which I've highlighted as non-generic adaptive task sequencing. So I've identified with the amber boxes just 5 different tasks you might do as a vehicle system forensics investigator to get data from a vehicle. Okay, those are vehicle network acquisition. We talked about these last time. Manual examination of the infotainment system, going through those menus. Recovering a module for a bench examination. A powered examination where we might be interacting with USB ports or SD slots on a vehicle to get data from it, and also third-party devices. So those are sort of the big 5 that you would generally be doing when you are interacting with a vehicle for the purposes of obtaining data from it. There may be 1 or 2 others in there as well, but I'll just list those 5. Underneath those 5, you are potentially going to have other SOPs that you need to write depending on the type of equipment you're using, the type of data that you're going after, and the type of car that you've got as well. So just as a food for thought, and again, this is not, by no means am I saying this is how you should do it or this is how you shouldn't do it, but if you were going to take the sub-activity, as I would call it, of a manual examination of an infotainment system, how are you going to write that SOP? Are you going to write it generically, dare I say, or are you going to make it bespoke for a certain manufacturer? Because some infotainment systems are fairly complex on new motor vehicles, and there's various different menus that you have to get into in order to find user data. So on a Mercedes M-Bus, I give that as an example because that's our test vehicle at the moment. That is quite a challenging head unit to navigate your way around the different menus if you've not encountered it before, even if it's just being able to get into some of the menus. So would you have a prescriptive SOP for examining a Mercedes M-Bus infotainment system? Because if you're just generic, it might not be prescriptive enough for your staff to be able to follow. Depends on your organization and how you're running your staff and their level of understanding. But with a lot of these quality management systems, we should be looking at a scenario whereby if you've done whatever you've done, somebody else could follow those processes that you've done and get the same results. So if you're not prescriptive enough in these SOPs, is there a chance that somebody else that comes into this with maybe different experience can't do or can't follow what you've written down as an SOP? And then, of course, you multiply that by the different amounts of infotainment systems that are out there. It's going to cause you a bit of a headache to try and do all those. Okay. Alternatively, you might want to make this generic to a degree and risk assess whether you are making a consistency management system at this low level or whether you're making a quality management system. And it goes back to what we're talking about, the making of a sandwich. You could say a simple SOP for that manual examination would be visit the most recent destinations in the sat-nav, visit the friendly names and photograph those of connected devices and any other user information you can find. Or you could be prescriptive and say, go to the Mercedes Me account, 3 submenus down, access the email address that's associated with the account. So food for thought really as to how you would do that. If I translate that across, well, not translate, but if I give you the other conundrum with regards to recovering ECUs from a vehicle, if I'm recovering infotainment systems from a vehicle, if I have an SOP that says recover the infotainment system off this vehicle, am I too generic with that? Are you going to give a step-by-step guide on how to recover that infotainment system? If it is a BMW 1 Series 2016 model year and you put the prescriptive steps down as to how to remove that infotainment module off that vehicle, that SOP is not going to work on a 2019 Audi. So are you going to write another one for your 2019 Audi? Or are you just going to keep it generic? Is the generic one sufficient enough that somebody else could follow it and get the same result? I don't know. I don't have the answers. You can imagine the time-consuming task that would be. If I give you what we've done in this regard, it might help you going forward. But if we have anything user-specific, shall we say, like encountering a BMW 1 Series on a 2016, then we create an SOP for that vehicle as we're doing it. Then, whenever we get another one of those, we've already got one. Don't need to do it again. And over time, you start to build up your library. So people will have heard me talking about our infotainment teardown video resources that we've got in the Vehicle Network app. Every time we go to a car and remove an infotainment system, we video that process. And that essentially is our SOP for how we get that off. So that if, God forbid, something happened to me, somebody could access the SOP, follow what I've done with regards to it, and get the same result, get the module out undamaged. So that's how you potentially can tackle it when you've got a vehicle population here in the UK that can exceed 40 or 50,000 different trim levels of vehicles. It's impossible. And when I jump back over onto manual examinations, how would you ever write, SOPs for every single infotainment system that's out there without being exposed to it? You wouldn't. So there's got to be some flexibility around it as well. And this is where the complexities come into it, because people don't realize how big the automotive industry is and how many different cars and brands of car and subtle differences and different ECUs can be put on vehicles just in the space of 6 months. It is absolutely massive. So when you're trying to write SOPs for doing things within the automotive industry, it becomes very voluminous and very time consuming, like eating an elephant. You've got to break it down. So that's how I potentially would look at writing some SOPs. If you want to be generic and just have one for the whole process, there's no two ways about it in my mind. You are going to risk losing data and potentially overwriting data on some systems and lose data as a consequence of having it generic. I would be generic up to a point of starting to interact with a vehicle with some flexibility around it. And then it's all back to linking into the strategy as to regards what you're going to do and in what order you're going to do it in, so that you can pick off those sub-activities, put them in the order you want them in, and you've got your SOPs underneath those sub-activities to tell you how to do that task at that time. And this is what this slide's about, adaptive task sequencing. So I'm just going to give you two quick examples of how this would work in a real life situation. If I've got a vehicle that is capable of storing GPS records very frequently, every second, on the infotainment system, and the priority data type for my investigation is GPS records, then I know from my own experience that as soon as I power that car on, it's going to start taking new GPS data in, and there's a potential that any existing data that's on it could become overwritten, deleted, and gone. So taking that information on board and knowing that I've got a tool and technique to get that data off, those 4 items that are listed at the top there, GPS records are my priority data type. The make, model, trim, and year of vehicle means it's got an infotainment system on it, i.e. the ECU, that stores GPS records. It's susceptible to being overwritten quite easily. I've got a tool or a technique to get that data off that system. Then number 4 on the activity of infotainment module removal is going to jump to number 1 in the queue. And I'm going to get that off before I do anything else to stop any new data coming from it. So I'm not going to power the vehicle on and do a diagnostics read and do some network acquisitions and plug a diagnostics reader into that car. I'm not going to start doing a manual examination of the infotainment system, because that's going to power the vehicle on and it's going to result in me losing some of that GPS data, and it could lose the GPS data over my time of interest. So I'm going to change around the order of which these sub-activities have been put in. So really, shouldn't be numbering them to give you a subconscious bias. But if you had a generic SOP, this is how it might look. You might say, right, once you've got the car and opened it up, always do a fault code read. We've got this other issue with vehicle system forensics. Do we fault code read or don't we? Because we're dealing with a safety critical system that potentially is going back out on the road afterwards. And we want to know that what we're doing with it, which is ancillary to the sort of forensic science activity itself, we've got something else to deal with, i.e. making the car, ensuring the car's safe and knowing what state it's in when we start working on it, to know whether or not we've made any changes to the vehicle's safety systems or whether it's previously been like that. That causes a little bit of a rub as well. But if you said that your process is generic and you do that at the start, then you do that with a risk that potentially you might lose some data, that's fine, as long as you account for it. But if you've got that generic SOP, then on some occasions you potentially, in that case, you're going to lose data or risk losing data and overwriting it. The other scenario might be you've got a vehicle involved in a crash. Your priority data type you want to know is, I want to know about the steering angle of this car in the lead up to the crash, because I think it's veered onto the wrong side of the road, and I want to see at what, how, whether it was a shallow steer or whether or not it was a severe steer, because you don't know. If that is your priority data type, it's on a make and model and trim and year of vehicle that you can access that type of data from the airbag control module, which is the ECU. You've got a tool to check it because it's supported by Bosch CDR. GPS data on the infotainment system is not really a need for your investigation. Yes, it might be nice to have afterwards, but it's not the priority. The priority here is the steering angle. So in this occasion, I'm going to go to the OBD port and I'm going to plug into there. I am going to power the vehicle on because I have to do that in order to read it. And I'm going to get that data off in the first instance. But in the knowledge that, yes, I might lose some GPS data, but it doesn't matter to me where the car was 3 days ago, because all I'm interested in is knowing whether this person drifted across the road and had the crash or whether they turned severely into the path of the other vehicle that's caused the collision. So that's just 2 examples to show you how you would be adaptive in your task sequencing for the sub-activities under the heading of vehicle system forensics as a forensic science activity in its own right. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense to you. If you've got any questions, by all means, put them either in the comments on YouTube or send me a direct message in the Vehicle Network application, or drop me an email to training@harpershaw.co.uk. It's not easy. And if we are going to be all about increasing the quality of our investigations and the forensic science that we put into the criminal justice system, then this video hopefully again goes somewhere to explain the difficulties that some organizations and departments are potentially going to have with regards to getting these processes A, in place, but B, understood to know that what we've got is right for that particular type of evidence that's going to end up in either the criminal arena or, you know, in a criminal arena where there can be a lot of other interested parties as well. So I am going to follow this up with a third video in the series, but I will leave it another month just to let people digest this. And that will talk about sort of the final stage of looking at how we, once we've got the data, validate the data and make sure that it is right, because there are a whole host of other issues that we have in validating these techniques and these activities that we're talking about, that we're going to be doing with the vehicle to get them off. And there is little in the way of research for us to be able to rely on in those types of validation cases, and there is a hell of a lot of work to be done in that field. So I think it warrants us looking at that in a separate video, which I will put out again probably at the end of November. So it's the weekend. Hope you get some R&R. Don't have nightmares. It's all manageable. You can't eat an elephant at once. Just break it down and start to build in those processes in order to show that you are working towards putting a good quality management system in place if you are responsible for putting evidence from modern vehicles in the UK's courtrooms.